We better start because we have only 2 hours and we're limited in time, and time is ticking already. We're delighted to have you here to participate in this discussion, to bring new ideas, to exchange opinions. And I would say that would be more appropriate to call it not conference, but community discussion or community dialogue or community workshop. Who organized this event? Australian Forum of Russian-Speaking Jewry, in collaboration with Australian Voices for Israel, and we're honored to have here Alan Friedman and Mary, Vice President. We're very thankful for support and for participation. Just 2 words for those who don't know who we are, Australian Forum of Russian-Speaking Jewry. We are part of global structure of World Forum of Russian Jewry. So World Forum of Russian Jewry has representation in Canada, in USA, in Europe, in Ukraine, in Israel, and about 2 years ago we officially registered a forum, Australian Forum here in Melbourne. Briefly, what we're targeting, we want to be integral part of local Jewish community, to unify Russian-speaking Jewish here, and definitely and obviously to cultivate and develop Jewish identity and Jewish tradition. So the format of today's forum is following. We have, I think, 5 topics, 6 topics. We will have a main presenter, main speaker on each topic for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we're going to discuss this topic. So altogether, probably 25 minutes, approximate time for each topic, right? Okay, so I hope this dialogue will be productive, and because 2 Jewish, 3 opinions, so how many of us here, just multiply, I don't know how it's going to be opinions and ideas in the end. So Alan, please.
Thank you, Rivka. Welcome to today's session. I only know 2 words in Russian, I'll confess. The first one is spasiba, and the second one is davleni, because I'm a pharmacist. So davleni, for those that don't know, is high blood pressure. So they're the only 2 words I know. So if we're going to talk about blood pressure, then I can join in, but otherwise it'll be in English. So as Rivka pointed out, we've got 6 topics. We're going to
7 hours.
No, one of them's not. One of them's been removed. Yeah. So the one that's been cancelled is Israel, the USA, Europe, and Russia. So we'll probably cover those issues in the other topics as well. So we've got 6 topics. We're going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes each, and then the idea is to open the floor up to you, because this is a discussion. It's not for you to just listen to us speak. And we want to provide you with a chance to have something to say. So we'll get started, and I'm just going to set my phone so that I don't go too far over time. So as it happens, my topic is the first one, and the topic is anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism today. And I guess what I started thinking about was, is anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism? And I'll come to answer that towards the end of my little talk. But when we start looking at anti-Semitism, I mean, we could spend the whole day talking about anti-Semitism. But I just want to touch on a few topics, and then as the discussion gets going, we can expand on these if we want to. Anti-Semitism in Europe, very topical. Anti-Semitism in America, I think we should have a bit of a look at that. Anti-Semitism in Australia, Arab anti-Semitism, Islamic anti-Semitism, because that's not necessarily Arab. Let's have a look at the United Nations, anti-Semitism in the media, and anti-Semitism on campus. So there's a lot of topics there. So let's just get started, and we'll just touch on these and see where we go. So firstly, there's anti-Semitism in Europe, and of course, you know, we've had lots of reminders about anti-Semitism in Europe in recent times. We've had the Charlie Hebdo attack and the kosher supermarket. This, by the way, President Obama said wasn't an anti-Semitic attack. It was just a random attack, but, you know, I think we've taken him to task on that. So certainly there was Jews killed because they were Jews in Paris. But going back a little bit of time, we've had the Belgian Museum. I imagine people remember that, when people were murdered in the Belgian Museum. We've also had the school in Toulouse, where the rabbi and 3 children were murdered by an Islamist, an Islamic terrorist. So Europe doesn't have a very good history of safeguarding anti-Semitism. In the United Kingdom, I think they're finding also that they are more and more, there's more and more hostility to Jews from the English society. And Melanie Phillips actually made a very interesting comment when she was here a little while ago that by and large British Jews are quite weak. They don't stand up to themselves. So I think England's got a bit to answer for there. We can even look at Sweden. Now, I just saw on the news the other day, there's a Swedish radio station is receiving heavy criticism after one of its journalists asked the Israeli ambassador on air, this is what the ambassador was asked on air, are Jews themselves responsible for the progression of anti-Semitism? So this was in Sweden. So, you know, we do see a lot of hostility from Scandinavia. I guess we also have to look at the concept of Holocaust denial, because you know, for the last 50 years or so after World War II, the Holocaust was pretty well, you know, not talked about. I mean, there was no denial, or there wasn't a lot of denial. But we are seeing now that people are actually going to deny the Holocaust. And of course, once the survivors all go, what's going to happen? Don't know. Let's move on to America. There's anti-Semitism in America. The Ku Klux Klan would be one of the major organisations that's a white supremacist organisation, well known for its anti-Semitic views. But even Richard Nixon, President Nixon, was quite a virulent anti-Semite. He did support Israel during the war, the 73 war, but personally he wasn't. He never had much nice to say about Jews. Then we've got Mel Gibson. So Mel Gibson always manages to embarrass himself and America, because he came out with some anti-Semitic rants. Amongst the African American community, generally they're considered to be not overly anti-Semitic, with the exception of an organisation called the Nation of Islam, which is run by a guy called Louis Farrakhan, who, if you've been following any of this stuff, you'll see that he's quite a nasty piece of work. University campuses in America are also becoming much more louder in their anti-Semitism. Mary is in touch with people over there who are promoting the Israel point of view. But you know, it's very difficult for them there. What about President Obama? You know, he has been accused of being anti-Semitic. I'm not sure I would necessarily want to go down that road. Certainly his treatment of Israel has been dreadful. But there are people who would consider him anti-Semitic, and especially now he is going to reassess, this was what he said, in light of Netanyahu's win, he's going to reassess America's response to Israel, which I find quite extraordinary, because what he's saying is that because he has a disagreement or he doesn't like Bibi Netanyahu, he's going to take it out on the whole Israeli population. Now, you could argue that that's anti-Semitic, and I think maybe it is. What about in Australia? Well, generally I think we're pretty fortunate in Australia. We don't We don't notice too much anti-Semitism, but a lot does go on. If you talk to anybody from the CSG, so the Community Security Group, so people are familiar with them, they're the people that stand out in front of the various venues when we have a function on. They're documenting all of the anti-Semitic incidents, and apparently there's quite a lot. We don't hear about them. At one stage there was eggings. I don't know if anybody's ever been exposed to that. If you're walking around on a Friday night after Shabbat dinner, that was very, not common, but it has happened that people would drive past and throw eggs at people. This actually happened to me. I was walking with a group of, with a few people, and a car pulled up behind us, so we didn't see it. And the next thing you know, there are eggs flying, and they splatter all over your clothes. There is verbal abuse, so there have been incidents of people driving along in Carlisle Street, Balaclava Road, and hurling abuse, anti-Semitic abuse. So it does go on. The BDS program, which of course is very well known, is becoming quite widespread. What about Arab anti-Semitism? Listen to what a Palestinian Authority fellow said on TV. He said, if a fish in the sea fights with another fish, the Jews are behind it. That's what he said. Humanity will never live in comfort as long as the Jews are causing devastating corruption throughout the land. This is on Palestinian TV. Humanity will never live in peace or fortune or tranquility as long as they are corrupting the land. That's the Jews. And what about Iran? Before Ahmadinejad, he wanted to wipe Israel off the map. Huge anti-Semitism from the Arab world. And it's not necessarily from the Arab world, because there are people that are actually tomorrow. We've got, there's this conference on tomorrow. It's supposedly called a peace conference. And one of the guests of honour, who is speaking tomorrow, is a Malaysian cleric by the name of Hussein Yee. He said that the September 11 terror attacks were neither unjust nor committed by Muslims. And this is the person that's speaking in Melbourne tomorrow. He also claimed that a group of Jews were having a party when they heard that the Twin Towers had been burned, and it was announced late at night, and he was the one. It was actually just announced late last night that he's going to be speaking at this peace conference tomorrow. So this is anti-Semitism right on our doorstep. Up in Sydney, the Bankstown Synagogue was firebombed some time ago, and it's never been rebuilt. This was in the early 1990s. And there's a Parramatta synagogue that's suffered arson attacks, and the congregation is small. It's never going to be rebuilt. Muslim youth, they put things out on their social media. Jews are profane, treacherous, cunning, not to be trusted. Mossad organised the September 11 hijackings to incite hatred against Muslims, and no Jews went to work in the Twin Towers that day, as they all received a special phone call telling them to call in sick. So here we see really quite nasty anti-Semitism right in Australia. Another one, Coca-Cola is a Jewish conspiracy. It is owned by Jews, and the writing on the side of the can reads in Arabic, no Allah, no Muhammad. This is what they teach each other. I'm running out of time. We could keep going. What about the United Nations? We remember the Durban Conference of 2001, which was supposed to be a conference on peace and multiculturalism, turned into the most virulent attack on Israel and Jews. It was shocking. The Goldstone Report, another gem produced by the United Nations. And of course we're seeing the Palestinians at the moment promoting their bid for statehood, and they're talking about the International Criminal Court. We need to mention also a little bit about the Australian media, and if I mention the ABC, I'm sure people will not be surprised to consider them anti-Semitic. Fairfax Media, I don't know whether anybody saw today's Sunday Age, but there's an article by Ruth Pollard, and it's about these poor Gazans who have to live in their home with an unexploded bomb that came crashing through their roof during the last war. No explanation of why that bomb needed to be fired, but this is what the Age does. And of course, it's not just Ruth Pollard. Before her, there was Paul McGough, there was Ed O'Loughlin, there was Jason Katsoukas. They've had a whole list of of Middle East correspondents that really don't care too much for Israel. Overseas, there's Thomas Friedman from the New York Times. He's sort of changed his position a bit. He sometimes writes something that's a bit centre, but he will write some very critical things. Anti-Semitism on campus, well, we have Israel Apartheid Week, big feature every year. So all of a sudden we're starting to see that, anti-Semitism, when you start adding it all up, there really is a lot of it around. What about the University of Sydney a couple of weeks ago with Richard Kemp? Jake Lynch, the supposed professor from peace studies, which is a joke, he barged in with some students proposing to shut down this talk. So it keeps going on. So that's anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism, of course, is a rejection of the state of Israel. And I won't go through some of the history because I'm sure you won't all know that. So basically my proposition is that is anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism? And I would argue that it is, because you don't see the same criticism of any other country. You don't see the same criticism of any other culture of people. So if they're going to pick the Jews and if they're going to pick Israel to criticise, and only the Jews and only Israel, then I would say that that's a form of anti-Semitism. So let me just finish there. I've probably gone a little bit longer than I intended to, but I'd be interested to hear your views. So anybody want to make any comments about anti-Semitism? Okay, let's start the conversation.
I don't think I need a microphone. What can be done about the poison which is being spread not only at university level but also in the form of political correctness to our secondary and primary education system?
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? Look, with the universities, I think part of the answer or part of the problem is that university life has changed. So these days, the students at university don't actually need to spend too much time on campus. They get their lectures online. And in fact, if you go to the lectures at university these days, there's a smattering of students in the hall. Everybody else is at home watching the thing online. So as opposed to the way it was when I was at university, which was, well, I don't know, 40 years ago, where people actually spent time on campus and lived on campus, these days the kids are not there. And when they do go there, they go there for their tutes or whatever they want to, and they're not interested in getting involved in all of that nasty political stuff. Opposed to that, the socialist alternative are professional agitators, professional students. They go to the university campuses because they've got nothing else to do but to stir up trouble. So when we ask what can we do about it, it's very difficult. I tend to think that the Australian Union of Jewish Students does a reasonable job. They could probably do more, but they're interested in getting their education. They're not there to put out bushfires because of all of the stuff that the opposition's doing. Certainly at the Jewish day schools, I think the Jewish day schools are doing a good job of, hopefully doing a good job of instilling a Jewish identity into the kids, because without a Jewish identity, the next generation is not going to be all that interested. So if anybody else has got some ideas, what do other people think?
Ella, there's one thing consistent. There is a Russian saying that fish start to rot from the head.
Yeah.
If you analyze the polls in America, United States, it's consistently during the last several decades, majority of the Americans support Israel. But regardless of this, most of the American presidents, and from the Republican and from Democratic Party, are running anti-Israel or neutral, so-called neutral, double underhanded positions. Therefore, the best way to deal with anti-Semitism, and it is cultural hierarchical position, like government positions, not the people position. Like, for example, in Latin America, many people are supporting Israel, but this government not, and so on. Therefore, the Jewish community need to expose this elitist anti-Semitism.
Well, I think they probably do. In America, we've got AIPAC, and they're a very pro-Israel organisation. And we've also got J Street, who are on the other side, which are causing a lot of damage. Fortunately, the Congress at the moment is Republican, and that's likely to be a bit more pro-Israel. So hopefully they'll be able to put the brakes on Obama.
They don't actually do this, but another point is, you mentioned about the unions. Several years ago, a grandmother came to me and said, could you help me with my grandson? He is a Monash University studying politics, and he is ashamed to be a Jew. The problem with the uni student is that in a school, and even in a Jewish union of students, they are not taught to be self-assertive and confident. Therefore, they do not feel, especially under the pressure and brainwashing from the lecturers, who are many leftists, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, they do not feel like standing up, and they are kind of shying off, and they feel not worthy of themselves.
Yes, and the kids have to learn not to be shy.
They have to be taught.
Yeah, well, that's right. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this?
Yes, sir. If you don't mind, can I ask you, this auditorium, this respectable auditorium, a question?
Take the microphone. Take the microphone. Give him the microphone, Roman.
Why don't we just ask ourselves a question? Is there any nation ever in the world that has become a subject to anti-ism, like similar to anti-Semitism? The entity of anti-Semitism is actually well known in the world from the time of essentially our stay in Egypt.
Yeah.
So, may I ask this respectable auditorium a question? Do you have any thoughts? Why is it the Jews, and really the Jews, that throughout the millenniums have always been the subject of persecutions, detest, hatred, false allegations, and etc., etc., etc.? And I think once we answer this question, I think there will be a lot of things that will come back into place, and we will understand what's going on and what can we do to combat that phenomenon.
Okay, does anybody want to have a go at answering that question?
For a start, jealousy.
Well, I think, just before we go, I think one of the reasons...
Why aren't we jealous to, say, Americans? Why aren't we jealous to English?
Some people are.
Yeah.
Why is it not an overwhelming world phenomenon like anti-Semitism is?
Well, the first thing that you need to remember is that the Jews as a cultural group have been around for a lot longer than any other cultural group. Most cultural groups throughout history have disappeared.
Okay, let's take, I'm just going to throw a counter argument to you. Take Khuzari. They were a tiny little group that spread there, adopted Judaism, and yet again, lived for a very short period of time, became the subject of anti-Semitism, and eventually was annihilated. How would you explain that?
Well, I don't know. Let's see. There's somebody, the lady there wanted to say something.
The lady in white sweater, white jumper, white tie.
Look, I think it's just very simple.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely good and evil, God and Satan. I know there might be secular Jewish people here, and there might be people who don't necessarily practice or whatever, but I definitely think when you look at that point that this guy makes, the only answer can be that The reason why it's universal and it's forever is this is never going to get settled until the end, until God wins this battle. And if you believe that that Jewish people are God's chosen people, in whatever way you understand it, I mean, right back to Abraham's day, which is when it all began, you really, why did God choose Abraham?
All right, let's hear from somebody else. We're just going to wrap this up in a few minutes' time.
Well, actually, I'll second that. I had a little Jewish lady in Israel ask me one day, Joy, you know, why do you love us? Why does everybody hate us? And I said, it's simple, Shula. You have G-O-D stamped on your forehead, and people immediately think of the Ten Commandments, all of that, and people don't like to be told that there is a God and that there are happy instructions for living. That's my answer.
Okay.
I don't know.
Anybody else want to have something to say on this? We'll take two more and then we'll move on to our next topic.
I don't think that this is a topic that can. I don't think this is a topic.
It must be under a speaker.
I'll give it away. I don't need it.
Just come out from the speaker. It's only feedback off the speaker.
I don't think this is a topic that can be answered in one session, because one could argue that it's because of God. One could argue that anti-Semitism, with the Enlightenment, with the birth of the Enlightenment, anti-Semitism became a kind of propaganda, if you like, anti-Jews, because they were supposed to be the leaders of the enlightened nations, be it communism or capitalism or any ism that you like to mention. So it doesn't matter whether it's from the religious perspective or from the secular perspective. There is something about Judaism that is unique. And I think it's that uniqueness that somehow the world doesn't get. Now, it's not the whole world that doesn't get it, because there are a lot of people that do get it. And a lot of people do respect what Judaism has brought to civilization. But this is a topic that I think needs a lot more discussion, a lot more thought, and so on.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Now I think there was the lady over there with pink scarf.
Yes, come up. Just one press of the motion.
Yeah, that's good. We'll hear from the lady, and perhaps one more, and then we'll move on to our next topic.
What I think might be one of the answers is that there's a lot of reasons, but I think most people in the world are tribal, and they belong to different communities, whether it's family or cultural or national. And the Jewish people have been around for thousands of years, and they are very unique in that they, on the one hand, they stick together, and what it is, it's whether it's their faith, whether it's culture, they come together and they are able to override a lot of the tragedies and a lot of the things that have happened. They keep surviving. And because we don't actually go out and promote who we are, we don't really encourage people to convert, and there's like, 0.1% of Jewish people in the world, most people would never have even met a Jewish person. So we are actually out there educating people. And because of the numbers, people don't get to find out about Jewish people because we don't really get to go out and talk about it. So that's one thing. The other thing is when things start to get difficult, whether it's economically or as it is now, the basic human nature is we find a scapegoat. And the scapegoat is always going to be a minority who don't fit in. And no matter what Jewish people do, they don't quite fit in. They don't fit in because, given their numbers, they actually excel in lots of different ways. And someone did mention about there is a jealousy because how is it that a certain group of people, no matter what they do, they can survive and even thrive. So that actually, I think, reflects a lot of things in other people that they don't want to understand unconsciously. You know, how can that person be successful when I'm not?
Yeah.
So it brings up that. But I think what happens is, like, when times get rough, let's find an individual, either as a bully that we can pick on, or as a group that we know because of their numbers they're not going to be able to do it. Now, people are also picking on Muslims, however, they have the advantage of numbers. So whether there could be anti-Muslimism, or whatever you want to call it, there probably is.
Well, we'll get to that very soon. So let's finish that bit there. Was there somebody who wanted to have a last word?
Yeah, because I introduced that sort of controversy, do you mind if I...
All right, well, let's
finish up
Okay, so let's just keep it brief because we want to give everybody a chance to cover all the topics.
I'm sorry, please. Yes.
I want to refresh the memory how the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, saw the problem of anti-Semitism and tried to answer. In his address to the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, the eighth leader of Zionism, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, summed up his life, his lifetime of experience. I am worried, but I don't see how I can stop it or what can be done. Anti-Semitism is a sort of a disease that spreads apparently according to its own laws. I only hope that it will never reach the terrible dimensions which it reached in Europe. In fact, I somehow think that the Anglo-Saxon countries may be immune from it, but that is a hope, a pure wish. And when I look at Canada, South Africa, Europe, even America, I sometimes lose my freedom from fear. I believe the only fundamental cause of anti-Semitism, it may seem tautological, is that the Jew exists. We seem to carry anti-Semitism in our knapsacks.
Okay, perhaps we might just put the brakes on it there. We need to move on to other topics, but I think we can come back to, I think what will happen is that we'll end up talking about lots of the different topics along the way. So, last word, very briefly.
I'll try to be brief. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah, just 2 minutes.
Interesting to say that there's a brilliant, once I read the Russian aphorism, and it goes like that: because the American Eskimos never encountered Jews, they encountered all of the troubles in the world to the evil forces of the nature. Otherwise they would have blamed Jews. Okay. Now, I was interesting to listen to the auditorium here, and everybody gave different opinions why there is such a phenomenon of anti-Semitism. And I interestingly, out of everybody, just picked up the first two ladies who spoke. And please forgive me, but I have a presumption that you are not Jewish, are you?
Jewish heart.
No, but you are not Jewish, you're not born Jewish, are you? And
not that I know of.
Ma'am, what about you?
I have a great-great-grandmother who was Jewish.
Okay, all right.
But
But you were not raised in a Jewish environment.
No.
Because interesting thing, just only these two ladies, not Jewish ladies in this auditorium, and it's funny enough, only they mentioned the word God. Okay? Please don't stop me. I understand. Please don't stop me.
We do have to move on.
Now, I understand, and that's where the problem is. Okay, because we move on in this situation. That's why there's so much of anti-Semitism out in the world out there.
Another one more minute, because we've got a lot of topics. All of these people are looking to get their say. So, yeah, let's come back to that. Let's come back to that. because we're all
been addressed tonight. That's within Islam, that Muhammad, the Prophet, said he's going to give us 1,000 years, not a day more, not a day less. Now, that was over 1,000 years ago. Now, the problem that we as non-Muslims face is that the Muslims blame the non-Muslims because they haven't converted. That's why Muhammad hasn't returned. That's why we're not living in this great era of peace. That you see, unfortunately, the three monotheistic religions have different ideas about the end of days. Judaism and Christianity are similar. Either Jesus will return or the Mashiach will come, and there'll be peace, the lion will be sleeping with the lamb, etc. And that's a very, very nice theory for the end of days. Unfortunately, Islam has a very different theory about the end of days. They believe that there will be world peace, but that's because everybody will be Muslim. And the other issue with Islam is you cannot de-Islamize a country according to Islamic law. If a country's been Islamic at any stage in its history, it's Muslim for all eternity. And because of the time of the Ottoman Empire, when the land of Israel was occupied by Muslims, they believe it's their land.
That's right. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Anybody else before we move on? Okay, let's move on to our next topic. Alex Staffen is going to speak on the Australian position on Israel. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Shalom, здравствуйте. Shalom Aleichem, whichever language you speak. I'm not speaking on behalf of any organisation, just myself, just in case you're associating me with any particular organisation. I have a fairly easy task compared to the other speakers, because, of course, as Shimon Peres said, Israel has no better friend than Australia in the world. The only friend that perhaps is doing better than Australia is Canada. But we had that worrying blip under the Labor government and under the Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, where Australia changed its position on voting in favour, if you like, of what the USA and Canada and 8 other countries voted on in terms of not condemning Israel for settlements on the West Bank. We've moved back to the position, I think, of the Canadians, the Americans, there's other countries that I won't name all of them. So, is Australia one of the best friends, if not the best friends, that Israel has? Well, we're living in a situation where we have to convince the government that, in fact, they have to keep and strengthen this position. We're not in a situation where some of the European countries are, where we have to, I say Jewish people and friends of Jewish people, have to convince their government that they need to change their position or strengthen their position. We're in fact living in an era of a special, unique situation where through the deeds of the Islamic State and Islam, radical Islam, as we've heard, the line of a proportion of the Australian population that sees Israel as the superior power, the aggressor, the oppressor, is softening. It's softening because people are seeing that countries are facing that terrible danger of an Islamic radical annihilation in the Middle East. And of course, Israel is very much on the front of that. So we're living in a situation in Australia where the tide, if you like, is turning our way again, having moved slightly the other way. But we shouldn't be, of course, complacent about that. Now, there are a few things that I think the Jewish community and those who are friends of the Jewish community and are rationally right-thinking people should be campaigning for. One thing is that it's really, I think, no point of arguing that Hamas is Islamic State and that Hezbollah is the Islamic State and firing rockets at Israel. We know they are. We know they did, of course. But any propaganda that tries to equate those two things loses against the argument that Israel is the dominant power, supported by the greatest superpower in the world. And people ignore the fact that thousands of missiles fell on Israel during the Gaza war. I think you'd agree with me if you've had those arguments. They're very hard, it's very hard to make that argument. So, what sort of argument should we be making? One of the arguments that we need to make really strongly, and is not made strongly, is the fact that not only is Israel a democratic state based on Western enlightened principles like Australia, and like those countries that Australians look up to, but that 20% of the population are Arabs, Israeli Arabs, Muslims, who are now the third largest bloc, I think, single bloc in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. Not all Muslims, some are Christians, granted. Can you imagine speaking to an average Australian in the street and say, can you imagine if Australia had a population of 20% Muslims? How you would feel about your security, how you would worry about what is happening in this country? I think they're the sort of arguments that we need to point out to Australians, and through them to convince the government to stay strong and to lead on this. Not the fact that Israel gets bombarded by missiles and therefore our reaction has caused the 2,000 or whatever deaths that occurred in Gaza. The Australian population supports the underdog, and it's very, very hard to argue that the Palestinians are not the underdog, as much as we would like to say they are not, and they are supported by 1.6 million Muslims. That is not an argument we're going to win with the way Australians view the world and the world geopolitical situation. So to me, that is one point that we need to argue. The other point is a more touchy one, and that is that it's not productive to constantly make ourselves seem as a united one group of 100,000 Jews that supports Israel government policy no matter what. I think that we need to get across the fact that Australian Jews are as diverse as Israelis are in their democratic support of a variety of positions. And the one thing that we will not, or that we all agree with, and the one thing that we will not give in on, is the right of Israel to exist. But the method towards solving the problem between Israel and Palestinians has got to be diverse, and it's got to be seen to be debated. And I think that the notion that we support the Israeli government, which happens to be Netanyahu at the moment, all but a few fringe groups, I think works against us. I think Australian people are more intelligent than that, and I think that they find that incredulous. So I think there are 2 points that we can work on immediately as a community, and to try and get across those 2 points to Australians, to strengthen the resolve of Australia to continue supporting Israel in the international forums and around the world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Okay, any comments? Is anybody worried about the Labor Party, for example? I must say I'm a bit worried about it because they seem to be drifting away from Israel.
I was just going to say that during the 20th century we've seen quite a dramatic shift with regard to anti-Semitism, which always seemed to be associated with the extreme on the right wing, is now finding itself in the extreme at the left wing, which is ironic because the left wing has its origins within Judaism.
Yes, and it's very puzzling to look at the left and see that they're critical of Israel, because the left are into, the egalitarianism and social justice and all the things that Israel, women's rights, gay rights, all the things that Israel supports. You would think the left would be very supportive.
Yeah, and I think the left can be persuaded quicker than the extremist, pro-Muslim faction, and that's why the Labor Party can be swayed by that sort of debate by convincing enough Australians to support Israel and its and the policies of that they propagate much quicker than say trying to convince those who support Muslims over Jews.
The problem is that some of the Labor Party politicians are actually making their pro-Palestinian views known.
Yes.
Of course, they represent the western suburbs of Sydney.
Well,
we know
this is going to be a problem.
Of course. But the party as a whole, I think the party, and I think it was Rudd that actually made that commitment, if you remember, that Paris responded and said that Israel is no better friend than Australia. I believe that the vast majority of the Australian Labor Party, particularly if there was a feeling in the community through their focus groups and so on that's turning towards Israel, would very quickly come around and take the pro-Israel position.
Yeah, possibly, but remember, Julia Gillard was very pro-Israel, and she got rolled by her caucus.
Yes.
So I think we might, hopefully, we won't be in a situation where the leader.
I'm not losing any sleep over that.
Okay.
I'm losing sleep over the fact that I have very rational, humanistic thinking Australians who are taking up the Palestinian position on a one-nation state, for example. The position on a one-nation state that involves Arabs and Jews together, and they don't see the problem. They don't see the dangers of that, and they are perfectly sane, rational thinking people. And I think that we've got to win that battle for hearts and minds of the rational thinking Australians to put the pressure on the politicians to do the right thing.
There's been an enormous amount of propaganda of victimhood that is part and parcel of the Islamic dialogue. And that goes right back to even the personality of Muhammad. They was the great victim and therefore had to get even and vengeance. So there's this victimhood thing is really played up all the time, whether it's even if when they're the aggressors. And this is regardless what Jewish people are doing in our community. If they always hit this nerve. We have to find ways to expose that and show it up for it.
But I think we also have to point out that Israel is the only true democracy in that it supports women's rights, that it equal rights of all its nationalities and all its peoples there. And I think that's the argument that will win it in Australia.
Okay, thanks, Alex. We'll move on because we've got half an hour left and we've got two more topics to cover. Next up is the BDS situation, and we have Lev Medras who's going to speak about that.
Thank you very much. There have been so many great speeches here, I don't know what to add to this. But what I want to tell you about so-called BDS, about boycott of Israel as a state and the businesses in particular. Boycott always followed state of Israel. From the first day of the creation of this state, it faced boycott from other countries around Israel.
Issues that we haven't covered yet.
I won't be too long because the second innings are about to start.
What's the score?
All out for 183.
Ooh!
So it should be an easy task. As I mentioned very quickly, Mary touched on the Ottoman Empire, and the key word that was brought up was caliphate. Now, I wanted to talk about, I suppose, Islamic extremism in the 20th century and how, I suppose, it all started. And what happened was, during the First World War in 1916, as everything was heading towards, looked like the momentum was swinging towards the Allies. France and England met up, and basically they decided what they would do to split up the Middle East. So what they had was the Ottoman Empire, which posed a great risk to them economically because they controlled the section that basically controlled all the sea routes. Now what they needed to do was they needed to cripple and divide the Ottoman Empire to make sure that that didn't happen. So what they did was they sent a guy by the name of T.D. Lawrence to convince the Arabs to fight against the Ottoman Turks, with a promise that after the war was done that they would create a united Arab kingdom with control of Greater Syria. Now, the truth is that was never their intention. It was all one big lie. We know that as well because at the end of the war, or towards the end of the war, there were two gentlemen, one from France, his name was Francois Georges Picot, and from Britain, Mark Sykes. Basically, they led the negotiations for the division of, I suppose, the old Ottoman Empire, and they created artificial borders that never really existed, with the intention to have the Arabs fight amongst themselves to make sure that the trade routes to the Western world were not compromised or jeopardized in any way. They threw a spanner in the works with the creation of a Jewish homeland as well, which subsequently, as we know as well, as Stephen mentioned, it was shrank significantly as well. So in 1921 or 22, the League of Nations adopted the new borders. As I mentioned, Palestine changed several times, and there was a promise for the creation of a Jewish homeland. Now, what happened was Sykes-Picot, it basically destroyed the hope for a united Arab kingdom and for control of Greater Syria as well. So what happened was the Arabs needed a rallying point, and they got it in the form of the Balfour Declaration. So they needed to find a scapegoat, and they found it in the Jews. What had happened was, for the Arabs to create a united Arab kingdom, all the land, including Israel, had to fall under their kingdom, and that wasn't going to happen. Now, in 1948, when Israel declared their independence, what happened was, we know that 6 armies, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, who else, and Lebanon as well. Anyway, they attacked Israel. Now, the promise of a Palestinian state was never going to work. It was never going to happen. How do we know that? We know that Jordan wanted Jerusalem, Egypt wanted the south, Syria wanted the northern part of Israel, and Iraq wanted also a central part, which is today's Tel Aviv. So there was never going to be a Palestinian state. So what happened was the Palestinians became pawns for the Arab world. Sorry?
There was no Palestinians on the land?
There was never any Palestinians, sure. The Arabs within Israel, which they called the Palestinians, basically that they became the pawns, and the Jews were also the pawns from the perspective of the Western world as well, because they needed to create a conflict there to make sure that the trade routes were open as well. So we've got 4 things that we've got to remember. First is Sykes-Picot. The second one is a united Arab kingdom, the rule of Greater Syria, the fact that the West lied, and then the 2, I suppose, post-pawns were the Arabs and the Jews, the Palestinians and the Jews. Now what happened was the terrorism basically started when the Arabs realised that they were pawns, being played by their own. So what happened was groups, the first terrorist group I suppose that was started was the Palestinian Liberation Organisation, which became also Black September, which they operated out of Jordan as well. And what happened was they blew up 3 Western planes airliners in Dawson Field in Jordan. Then they assassinated the Jordanian Prime Minister as well. And then we know the Munich Olympic massacre in 1972. And what happened was Black September ceased to exist in 1974, but terrorism and I suppose the indoctrination of hate, particularly in the Palestinian territories, had already started and began manifesting itself. So what do we know? How does this relate to, I suppose, ISIL meaning Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant being everything, Israel included as well. Basically, to cut a long story short, what they want is they want that caliphate back. It was what was promised to them after the First World War, and they're not going to stop at anything until they get it. Now, we know as well, as we were talking earlier, the mentality is once we've gone this far, assuming they take back their caliphate, why stop? Let's take over the whole world. So that's basically the foundations of ISIS, of who they are, what they want. There's a lot of videos on that as well. A lot of the videos that they've recently released talks about Sykes-Picot as well, and basically the abolishment of borders and the establishment of a caliphate as well. That's pretty much it, what I wanted to talk about. From a perspective of the Western world, unfortunately I think it's too late, because fascist regimes are now will rise in Europe, and you can see that as well. Le Pen's party, which is doing very well in France, Austria as well. The other thing as well, Russia is sponsoring the fascist parties as well in Europe, and it's going to be very interesting to see what will happen. I'm tipping that there will be a civil war within Europe between the Muslims and the Christians, and if I was a Jew, I'd be looking one eye to Israel. Thank you very much.
We've actually come to the end of our session. It's gone very quickly. I was looking at my watch. I thought we had another hour, and we've actually used up a lot of our time. So thank you everybody for coming. Big thank you to Rivka for organising this. Thank you to our speakers, and
special thanks for the speakers and for Australian Voices for Israel for the support and participation, and we're looking forward to.
Right, well, we can do it again sometime. So thank you everybody. I think there's still some food there, so people can have a chat for a few minutes before they leave. Okay, thank you. We'll see you all next time.